Your silence is not peace, it's your spirit shutting down. Dostoevsky, there is a silence that lives inside you right now, and it is not the silence of calm. It is not the silence of someone who has found peace and rests within it. No, this is a different silence altogether. This is the silence of something dying. You feel it when you sit in a room full of people and realize you have nothing left to say, not because the conversation bores you, but because something inside you has stopped reaching outward. You feel it when someone asks how you are, and the word fine leaves your mouth before your mind even registers the question. You feel it in the way you no longer argue, no longer fight for what you believe, no longer raise your voice when something offends your soul. There was a time when words poured from you, when you had opinions that burned, ideas that demanded expression, emotions so vivid they could not be contained. You spoke because you were alive, because to be alive meant to participate in the world with the full force of your being. But now the words have dried up, the fire has gone quiet, and you tell yourself, this is maturity, this is peace, this is acceptance. But deep down, beneath the carefully constructed stillness, you know the truth. Something has gone silent that should not be silent. Something has shut down that was once the most vital part of who you are. And the terrifying thing is you cannot remember exactly when it happened. It crept in slowly, like frost forming on a window overnight. You went to sleep one version of yourself and woke up muted, dampened, sealed shut. Dostoevsky understood this silence better than perhaps any writer who ever lived. He spent his entire existence exploring the corridors of the human soul, the hidden rooms where truth hides and suffering speaks. And he knew, with the certainty that only comes from having lived through the darkest nights of the spirit, that the most dangerous silence is the one we mistake for peace. Let me tell you something that may unsettle you, but you need to hear it. You are not at peace. You are not calm. You are not in some elevated state of detachment that comes from spiritual growth. What you are experiencing is a kind of inner death, a slow, quiet withdrawal of your spirit from the surface of your life. And you have confused this withdrawal with tranquility, because the world taught you that silence means serenity, that not reacting means you have risen above, that swallowing your truth means you are strong. But Dostoevsky would look at you now and see something very different. He would see a soul that has been forced underground, a spirit that stopped speaking not because it had nothing to say, but because it learned that speaking brought punishment, misunderstanding, exhaustion, or worse, complete indifference. You are not broken for feeling this way, but you are in danger, because the silence you carry is not rest, it is resignation. And resignation, when it is mistaken for peace, becomes the quietest form of self-destruction there is. Dostoevsky understood that silence is never neutral. It always carries a charge, a meaning, a hidden architecture. In his works, he explored the many faces of human silence with a precision that borders on the surgical. He knew that when a person stops speaking their truth, it is never because the truth has disappeared. It is because the cost of speaking became too high. The soul did not lose its voice. It buried it, and this burial, this deliberate entombing of the authentic self, is what Dostoevsky would have recognized as the most common and least understood form of spiritual suffering in the modern world. What you call your quietness, your withdrawal, your lack of desire to engage. Dostoevsky would call the retreat of the spirit into the underground. He would see in your silence the same psychological architecture he mapped so brilliantly in his works, the architecture of a consciousness that has turned inward, not out of wisdom, but out of wound. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky created one of the most revealing portraits of what happens when a soul shuts down while the body continues to function. The underground man is not silent because he has nothing to say. He is perhaps the most articulate character in all of literature. He overflows with observations, analyses, confessions, and contradictions. But his speech has turned entirely inward. He speaks only to himself, in endless loops of self-examination that never reach the surface of his life. He has retreated from the world, not because the world defeated him in any obvious way, but because the gap between what he perceives and what others are willing to acknowledge became too wide to bridge. And so he went underground. He chose silence over the exhaustion of being perpetually misunderstood. Dostoevsky understood that this retreat is not cowardice. It is the logical response of a sensitive consciousness to an environment that punishes depth. When you speak your truth and receive blank stares, when you express your genuine feelings and are met with discomfort, when you share your observations about the world and people look at you as though you have said something inappropriate, the soul eventually learns to be quiet, not because it agrees with the silence, but because it can no longer bear the cost of speech. And this is where something even more insidious begins to happen, something Dostoevsky charted with the precision of a cartographer mapping the interior continents of the soul. When a person goes silent in this way, they do not simply stop speaking. They begin to lose access to their own inner world. The thoughts that once surged through them with such force and clarity begin to dim. The emotions that once colored every experience begin to fade into a uniform gray. It is as though the act of suppressing outward expression slowly strangles inward experience as well. You cannot silence the voice without eventually silencing the heart that gave it words. Dostoevsky saw this connection with painful clarity. He understood that expression is not a luxury of the soul, but its oxygen. When you cut off the expression, you suffocate the source. But here is what Dostoevsky discovered in his relentless exploration of the human condition. And this is the part that few people are willing to face. The silence does not stay contained. It does not remain a private arrangement between you and your pain. Once the spirit begins shutting down, the shutdown spreads. It moves from your voice to your emotions, from your emotions to your desires, from your desires to your sense of meaning itself. What begins as not wanting to talk becomes not wanting to feel. What begins as withdrawal from conversations becomes withdrawal from life. The silence that started as a protective measure becomes a prison, and you become both the prisoner and the guard, maintaining your own captivity because you have forgotten that the door was never locked from the outside. Dostoevsky mapped this progression with devastating clarity through his characters. Consider Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Before his crime, before his fall, there is a man who has already gone silent in the ways that matter most. He has stopped engaging with his studies, stopped maintaining friendships, stopped participating in the basic rhythms of human connection. He lies in his cramped room, staring at the ceiling, and the world outside his window continues without him. His silence is not peace, it is a pressure building toward catastrophe. Dostoevsky shows us that when the spirit shuts down, the energy does not simply vanish, it transforms. It becomes something dark and compressed, something that will eventually demand expression in ways the conscious mind never intended. Raskolnikov's silence breeds his terrible theory, his conviction that he exists above ordinary moral law. This is not the philosophy of a healthy mind. It is the philosophy of a suffocated spirit desperately seeking air. And Dostoevsky understood that this suffocation, this shutting down, happens to countless people who never commit crimes, but who slowly, imperceptibly, lose contact with the living current of their own existence. There is another dimension to this silence that Dostoevsky explored with particular insight, the silence that comes from seeing too much truth. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot arrives in the world with a soul so transparent, so genuinely open, that he reflects everyone's hidden reality back to them. And what does the world do with this beautiful, truthful presence? It destroys him, not through malice alone, though there is malice, but through the simple inability of ordinary consciousness to bear being seen so clearly. Mishkin's tragedy is the tragedy of every person who has gone silent because their clarity became unbearable to others. You may recognize this in yourself. There was a time when you spoke what you saw, when you named the things others preferred to leave unnamed, when your honesty was not a weapon, but simply the natural expression of a soul that could not pretend. And the world, in its thousand small ways, taught you to stop, not with a single dramatic moment of rejection, but with an accumulation of flinches, withdrawals, changed subjects, uncomfortable silences that followed your truths, each one a small message that said your perception is unwelcome here. And so you learned the art of strategic silence. You learned to read the room and adjust not your perception, but your expression of it. You learned to hold back, to filter, to translate your deep seeing into acceptable banalities. And somewhere in this process, something essential broke. The filter that was meant to be temporary became permanent. The strategic silence became your default state. And now, you sit inside your quietness, wondering why everything feels so flat, so distant, so unreachable. Dostoevsky would tell you that this flatness is the direct consequence of spiritual self-betrayal, not the dramatic kind that makes for great literature, but the quiet, daily kind that happens every time you swallow a truth that needed to be spoken, every time you smile when you want to weep, every time you say nothing when everything inside you is screaming. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan presents his rebellion not as a rejection of God, but as a refusal to accept a world built on the suffering of innocence. And what makes Ivan's position so devastating is not its theological implications, but its emotional honesty. Ivan speaks what most people only feel. He gives voice to the outrage, the grief, the moral bewilderment that lives inside anyone who has truly looked at the world without filters. And yet Ivan's honesty does not save him. It consumes him, because honesty without integration, truth-seeing without a container strong enough to hold what is seen, leads to exactly the kind of spiritual shutdown you are experiencing now. But Dostoevsky did not leave his readers in despair. That is the misunderstanding of those who read him superficially. Yes, he painted the darkest corners of the human soul. Yes, he showed us characters who were broken, tormented, driven to the edges of sanity by the weight of their own consciousness. But in every work, buried within the suffering like a seed beneath frozen ground, there is a path forward, and that path does not lead back to the naive speech of someone who has never been wounded. It leads toward something harder and more luminous, the conscious choice to speak again from a place of integrated wholeness rather than fractured innocence. Consider Alyosha Karamazov. He is not silent. He is not loud. He exists in a space that Dostoevsky crafted with extraordinary care, a space between the extremes of his brothers. Alyosha has seen the darkness. He has heard Ivan's rebellion and felt its power. He has witnessed Dmitri's chaos and understood its source. He carries the knowledge of human suffering and moral complexity that could easily drive him underground, as it drove Ivan toward madness. But Alyosha chooses a different response. He speaks not with the reckless honesty that destroys, but with the tender precision of someone who has earned the right to truth through compassion. This is what Dostoevsky offers as the antidote to the silence that shuts the spirit down. Not louder speech, not forced expression, not the artificial positivity that modern culture prescribes as medicine for every ailment of the soul, but rather a return to authentic expression that has been tempered by suffering and refined by self-knowledge. Dostoevsky did not offer easy solutions because he respected the depth of human experience too much for that, but he pointed toward certain truths that serve as lanterns in the underground darkness. The first truth is this: your silence must be acknowledged for what it is before it can be transformed. As long as you call your shut down peace, you remain trapped. The underground man's tragedy is not that he went underground, but that he convinced himself the underground was his home. The moment you name your silence honestly, the moment you say to yourself, "This is not calm, this is collapse," you have already begun to move toward the surface. This naming is not a small thing. It is an act of tremendous courage, because it requires you to admit that the armor you built to protect yourself has become the very thing that is killing you. The second truth Dostoevsky illuminates is that the spirit does not shut down because it is weak. It shuts down because it is overwhelmed by its own depth. Your silence is not a sign of emptiness. It is a sign that you contain more than your current life has room for. You went quiet because you felt too much, saw too much, understood too much for the narrow channels that were available to you. And so, the excess had nowhere to go but inward, where it sits now, compressed and aching, waiting for a passage back into the world. Dostoevsky knew this because he lived it. His years in the Siberian prison camp did not destroy his voice. They transformed it. The silence imposed upon him became the furnace in which his greatest insights were forged. He emerged from that silence not diminished, but deepened, not broken, but broken open. During those 4 years in chains, surrounded by criminals and stripped of every external identity he had constructed, Dostoevsky discovered something that would shape everything he wrote afterward. He discovered that the human spirit, when compressed to its absolute limit, does not extinguish. It concentrates. It becomes denser, more potent, more desperately alive. The letters he wrote after his release vibrate with an intensity that could only come from a man who had been forced into the deepest silence and found at the bottom of that silence not emptiness but a burning, inextinguishable flame. This is the possibility that exists within your own silence. If you are willing to stop running from it and start listening to what it holds, your silence contains compressed life. It contains every truth you swallowed, every feeling you denied, every insight you buried because the world was not ready for it. And all of that compressed material is not dead. It is waiting. It is building pressure. And it will either find a conscious channel of expression or it will find an unconscious one. And the unconscious channels, as Dostoevsky showed us, through character after character, are never gentle. The third truth is perhaps the most challenging. Dostoevsky saw that the path out of the underground is not a solitary journey. The underground man remains trapped precisely because he refuses genuine connection. He reaches toward others and then recoils again and again, caught in the terrible loop of longing and withdrawal that defines spiritual isolation. But in his greatest works, Dostoevsky showed that healing begins not in solitude, but in the terrifying act of allowing yourself to be known by even one other soul, not known in the shallow way of social pleasantries, but known in the way that Alyosha knows his brothers, with full awareness of their darkness and a refusal to look away. Your silence will not break in isolation. It will break in the presence of someone who can hold what you have been carrying alone. Someone who does not flinch when you speak your unfiltered truth. Someone who recognizes in your words not madness or negativity, but the honest testimony of a soul that has been paying attention. The fourth truth is that your silence is asking something of you. It is not a dead end. It is a question, and the question is this: are you willing to rebuild your relationship with your own voice, knowing that the voice that emerges will not be the voice you lost, the person you were before? The silence cannot be recovered. That innocence, that unself-conscious expressiveness that belongs to a chapter that has closed. But what can emerge, what Dostoevsky showed us again and again through his most luminous characters, is something greater. A voice that has passed through fire and carries within it both the sorrow of what was lost and the hard-won wisdom of what was found in the ashes. This is not the loud voice of someone who has never been hurt. It is the quiet, sure voice of someone who has been shattered and gathered themselves back together, deliberately, with full consciousness of every crack and seam. Dostoevsky wrote that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. He did not say this to glorify pain, but to point toward a truth that the modern world desperately wants to deny. That depth is forged in darkness, that the most meaningful words come from those who have known the deepest silence, that the spirit must sometimes shut down completely before it can restart in a form powerful enough to bear the full weight of an authentic life. Your silence, the one you carry now like a stone in your chest, is not the enemy. It is the chrysalis. Inside it, something is being reformed, restructured, made stronger and more true than anything that came before. But you must participate in this transformation consciously. You must stop telling yourself that you are fine when you are not. You must stop performing contentment when what you feel is the hollow ache of a voice imprisoned. You must begin, slowly, carefully, with whatever courage you can gather, to let the truth back out, not all at once, not recklessly, but with the deliberate intention of someone who knows that their silence has gone on too long and that the cost of continued silence is the slow death of everything that makes them real. Start where it feels safest. Start with a journal where no one reads the words but you. Start with the prayer that is not addressed to any deity, but simply to whatever is listening in the vast interior of your own being. Start with the admission, spoken aloud to yourself in an empty room if necessary, that you have been slowly disappearing and you are tired of pretending you have not noticed. Write down what you would say if there were no consequences, if no one could judge you, if the world were safe enough to hold your unedited truth. You do not need to show these words to anyone, but you need to hear yourself speak them, even if only on paper, even if only in a whisper, because every word you recover from the silence is a piece of yourself returning from exile. And understand this: the discomfort you feel when you begin to speak again is not a sign that you should stop. It is a sign that you are touching something real. Dostoevsky never portrayed transformation as comfortable. Raskolnikov's redemption begins not with relief, but with the searing pain of confession. The underground man's tragedy is that he reaches the threshold of honest expression again and again, but always retreats at the final moment, choosing the familiar agony of silence over the terrifying liberation of truth. Do not make his mistake. The discomfort is the doorway. Walk through it. Dostoevsky would tell you that this admission, humble and trembling as it may be, is the first crack in the wall. And once the wall cracks, light enters, not all at once, not without pain, but with the unstoppable force of something that was always meant to be. Remember this as you sit in your silence tonight, as you lie awake in the dark and feel the weight of all the words you have not spoken pressing against your ribs. You were not made for this silence. You were made for expression, for connection, for the full and unreserved participation in the human experience that only comes when the soul is allowed to speak in its own voice. Dostoevsky spent his life showing us that the human soul cannot be permanently silenced. It can be driven underground. It can be compressed. It can be forced into shapes it was never meant to hold. But it cannot be killed. It waits. It endures. And when the time comes, when the person who carries it finally decides that authenticity matters more than comfort, more than acceptance, more than the terrible safety of saying nothing, the soul rises. It rises not as it was before, pristine and untouched, but as something forged in the deepest fires of human experience, something that has earned every word it speaks, something that carries within its voice the full testimony of what it means to have been silent and to have chosen, at last, to speak again. Your silence is not your story's end. It is the dark chapter before the dawn. It is the underground passage that leads, if you have the courage to keep walking, toward a light that is not the comfortable glow of old illusions, but the fierce, uncompromising radiance of a truth that has survived the worst and emerged unbroken. Dostoevsky believed in this transformation with every fiber of his being. He lived it. He wrote it into every page, and he offers it to you now, not as a promise that the pain will disappear, but as an assurance that the pain means something, that your silence means something, that you mean something, and that the voice waiting inside your silence is worth every ounce of courage it will take to set it free. If these words found you in the midst of your own silence, tell me in the comments what you recognized. Tell me which part made you realize that your quiet was not peace but something that needed to be heard. Your words may reach someone who sits in the same silence tonight, believing they are the only one. Subscribe for more reflections through the lens of Dostoevsky's understanding of the human soul, where we explore the hidden territories of consciousness that most people never dare to enter. And if you're ready to go deeper, watch my video on why those who see the truth are always punished for it, where Dostoevsky reveals why the world turns against those who refuse to pretend. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for beginning, even now, to let your silence speak.